Hey everybody, welcome to Polytech, where technology meets the truth in politics. I'm your host, Dale Gibler. Today we're going to dive into one of the most debated and misunderstood topics in American democracy. And you're probably going through a million things in your head, but what we're going to talk about today is voting machines and voting process. Recently, President Donald Trump reignited the controversy, saying these voting machines are highly inaccurate, very expensive, and seriously controversial and inaccurate. Yeah, he likes to repeat himself. He vowed to eliminate them entirely, pushing instead for hands-on counting of ballots. This is a dramatic statement that feeds a powerful narrative to his base and to everybody else, one of mistrust, manipulation, and fear. Well, he clearly understands that every voting machine electronic has a paper trail, and that the data and information and outcome from the digital format of it is always checked by the physical output as well. So a lot of fear going on there. But I've been on the inside of this issue. When I served as Chief Technology Officer for the Florida Democratic Party, I worked alongside voter protection teams to conduct comprehensive audits on integrity and security of those voting machines within the systems in Florida. So now, let me be clear. We couldn't physically access the machines, means we couldn't open the door, walk in the room, flip on the on switch on the machine, play around with it, do actual physical examinations of it, because that's not legal and acceptable in most states. However, we could do the next best thing, and we could do a written audit that was very detailed to find out the information that we needed to make sure these machines were clear. So what we built was a detailed data-driven audit framework, one that tracked the entire life cycle of voting machines from the moment it arrived from the vendors to post-election storage and certification afterwards. So we tracked everything from beginning to end. And we backed it up with things like phone interviews and live interviews with supervisors of elections or SEOs across each one of the voting stations or districts. Our mission was really simple. Cut through the rhetoric and find out, are the machines really secure and the integrity good for the vote? The audit with the fundamentals, I want to cover that so you kind of understand what that is. So we looked at vendor protocols. We reviewed how machines were sourced, verified, and certified. And in Florida, every unit must pass both the federal certification through the Election Assistance Commission and actually the state verification before they're actually deployed out. This includes things that are very direct, such as reviewing the firmware signatures, encryption standards that are put on all the machines and the data, and the tamper-evident hardware design that exists, and whether or not any upgrades were done to any one of these things along the way. So next we looked at things like, the pre-election procedures. Every county conducts what is called a logic and accuracy test. Basically a mock election run in public view, so there's transparency. The test ballots are run through the system or the machine. The results are checked against expected outcomes, and the whole process is documented and signed by a bipartisan officials or team to make sure that it's accuracy. So that's transparency built into the system. So we also examine the chain of custody, which is important, right? Because if you remember from elections, one of the things that was in the news, and which was misinformation, is that a bunch of electronic ballots posted or printed out were dumped on the side of the road. And we saw people unloading them in trucks. So the chain of custody is so important. One of the most important things, and least understood part of election security. So we asked the following things, right? So who moved the machines? How were they sealed? Where are they stored at? And who has access to this? And when did they have access to it? Do you have documentation of this? Were there passcodes, IDs, facial recognition, such as biometrics, that were used to access certain things? And where are these records and where do you keep them? Most supervisors were extremely cooperative throughout all of this information, but not all of them were. So some counties refused to participate in withheld and public documentation. What that did is it evoked a process of legal action from our side. So we would file a lawsuit or we would file a request for documentation under the Florida Public Records Law to compel compliance. And after that, majority of them would comply with that without us having to take any other legal actions or obligations against them. So once we gathered all this data, we mapped it against best practices in security and cybersecurity and integrity. So we reviewed, for example, how the results were transmitted, and every SEO confirmed the same thing, right? So Florida's tabulation systems are air-gapped. They're not connected to the internet, not during testing, not during voting, not during counting. So this is just like one of the questions that we ask because it's important. Because even if they were air connected or otherwise Wi-Fi connected to the system, to the internet, that means that hackers or intruders could get into the system and make changes. So we had to make sure that it was valid, that nobody got in. So vote data moves only through encrypted, verified physical media. This was another important thing on the audit that we needed to make sure that the data was encrypted and everything was verified as far as if it was moved over to any physical media that was being used, such as thumb drives, etc., with signature logs available and redundancy checks at every single step of that for a particular process. So we also examined post-election processes. So how the results are audited, how discrepancies are handled, and how voter-verified paper ballot backups for every machine count was stored, collected, etc., and make sure that they weren't manipulated or changed along the process of the change of handling that. So that paper trail is what allows recounts and public audits to be both transparent and reliable. So if I remember some of and most of the misinformation that was being put out in the 2020 election was that, sure, these machines are tallying these voter counts incorrectly, and there's no way to validate whether or not they're accurate, which is untrue by most law, state and federal law. These machines have to push out a physical document or paper trail as well, just in case there needs a recount to be done, and it can be physically counted. And I've been involved with many different recounts from different states. So what did we find? Like, what did we actually find in our group? Our auditing concluded that with the scope of our access and documents, Florida's voting systems were secure. The vulnerability we identified weren't technical at all. They were most procedural. There were gaps in things like training, inconsistency in some documentation, and varying interpretation of state guidelines for each one of the counties and voting polls that were out there. So these types of things are process corrections, meaning that as the SEO goes through this, and then you have these auditing done, these types of corrections are usually taken care of way before election dates or the election day. But those are, like I said, very fixable things. And when addressed, they make the system even stronger and more powerful. So what we didn't find was any credible evidence of machine tampering, data manipulation, altercations or alterations that were in the system. We found nothing of the sort. The machines did what they were designed to do. They are designed to record, score, and report votes accurately and keep a paper trail that can be used to confirm the vote if there was any recount. That's and it's not an opinion, that is actually a fact. So when someone says to me, or should say to you, these machines are rigged, ask them the following question. Have you seen the audits or any audits on machines? Have you talked to election officials about this and your concerns? Have you reviewed the chain of custody, the test logs, the seals, etc.? If you're going to make a statement, any type of statement at all, with this type of power and depth, then you should realize you need to do your own research. Everything that I talked about is public and can be obtained. You can request it. You can see whether or not logs and test logs were done. You can see whether or not records are sealed. All of these things are available for you to see. So, what's the big problem? What do I think is the big problem and threat to democracy? Because it sure the heck isn't the machines. It is misinformation. It's probably more powerful than the concern of machines' integrity. And this is a big concern. When I was in Florida, when we did the presidential election, some of the things that were of concern that were more powerful than the voting machines was the misinformation put out on social media. Let me give you an example of this. So, one of the things was that voting centers or polling centers were closed or hours were changed. And that was posted throughout multiple social media accounts. This is more of a threat to democracy than the misinformation put about the voting machines itself, because it could deter hundreds of voters from going to precincts to actually vote, or showing up at another precinct that they weren't allowed to vote at, or one that it didn't exist at all. So think about that, and when next time you post something, think about what you're posting or what you're reposting. So I'm Dale, and this is Polytech. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and always follow the facts. Thank you.